Alexis Scott began her morning just like any other. The alarm rang at 6 a.m., the same as it did every weekday. She got up, brewed her coffee, and mentally ran through her to-do list for the day. Between her job as a community volunteer, helping out with her son's school fundraiser, and managing her weekly commitments at the local shelter, her schedule was packed, but Alexis enjoyed staying busy. She felt deeply connected to her community and had grown up here, knowing almost everyone in town. Her reputation as a reliable, caring, and hard-working woman had earned her respect from neighbors, shop owners, and city council members alike. Today felt routine. A regular Tuesday morning with clear skies and nothing out of the ordinary. After her coffee, she grabbed her purse, phone, and the lunch she packed the night before. The plan was to stop by the local hardware store, grab some supplies for the community center, and then head over to her first appointment for the day. She had no idea how drastically this day would change, or that within the hour, she would find herself in a situation that would make her question everything she thought she knew about her town and the people entrusted to protect it. Alexis was driving along the main road, humming along to her favorite radio station, when she noticed flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't think of anything she'd done to warrant being pulled over. She always followed traffic rules. She pulled over to the side, confused but calm, assuming this would be over in a few minutes. The officer, a tall, imposing man with a sharp gaze, approached her vehicle slowly. As he neared, she noticed his expression was stern, almost hostile, which struck her as odd for such a routine stop. She rolled down her window and greeted him politely. "Good morning, officer. Is there something wrong?" Without a greeting or even looking her in the eye, he replied, "License and registration, ma'am." His tone was cold, and Alexis immediately felt a pang of unease. Nonetheless, she complied, handing over her documents, hoping this would soon be resolved. The officer, whose name tag read Harris, took her documents without a word and walked back to his car, leaving her waiting in silence for several minutes. She could feel the minutes dragging by as the officer stayed in his car longer than she expected. When he finally returned, his demeanor seemed even colder than before. "Where are you heading?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. She answered truthfully, explaining that she was on her way to run errands for the community center. But instead of acknowledging her answer, he seemed to zero in on her with an unsettling intensity, his eyes narrowing as if searching for something to confirm an unspoken accusation. Then he abruptly asked, "Are you carrying any weapons or contraband?" Alexis was taken aback by the question, her mind racing to make sense of it. She had been pulled over before for minor traffic stops, but this felt different, almost like an interrogation. "No, officer, I'm not carrying anything illegal," she replied, maintaining her composure though her nerves were starting to fray. She tried to keep her voice steady, resisting the urge to ask why he was being so confrontational. Harris, however, seemed unsatisfied with her answer and leaned closer, his gaze hardening. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Now alarmed, Alexis glanced around and noticed a few bystanders watching from across the street. She could feel the heat of their stares and sensed their curiosity turning into quiet concern. Harris's tone left no room for negotiation, and she knew she had no choice but to comply. She got out, trying to keep her composure as she stood by the side of her car, watching as he began a meticulous, almost exaggerated inspection of her vehicle. The longer the inspection went on, the more Alexis's nerves frayed. Every time she thought he was done, Harris would pause, mutter to himself, and continue his search, even going so far as to open her glove compartment and rifle through her personal belongings. Alexis had never felt so helpless, so exposed, as she did standing there while he intruded into her life without explanation. When he finally closed the door, he looked at her with a smirk that she would later describe as chilling. "I'm not finding anything today," he muttered, almost as if disappointed. Just as she thought the ordeal was over, another police car pulled up, and a second officer joined the scene. His demeanor was friendlier, but it was clear he was there to back up Harris, standing in silent solidarity. Alexis's mind raced with questions. Why had this turned into a spectacle? Why was she, a law-abiding community volunteer, being treated as though she were a criminal? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind Harris's behavior, something rooted in an assumption or bias that went far beyond this single traffic stop. As the crowd of onlookers grew, Alexis realized her choice had become clear: either stand up for herself now or allow this treatment to pass without challenge. It felt like an impossible decision. Alexis stood beside her car, acutely aware of the eyes on her from across the street. A small crowd had begun to gather, sensing the tension in the air. The second officer, Officer Grant, approached Alexis, his expression more neutral than Harris's but offering no reprieve. He spoke to her briefly, acknowledging that she wasn't being cooperative. The words stung. She had done everything she was asked, and yet the situation continued to escalate. The two officers exchanged a glance that Alexis couldn't quite decipher, but she could feel their shared sense of power, their silent assurance that they could keep this going as long as they wanted. The uneasy feeling in her gut turned to dread as Officer Harris's voice took on an edge of impatience. "We'll have to take a closer look. I'll need you to stay here while we verify some things," he said, in a tone that barely hid his contempt. He then muttered something into his radio, casting a quick, dismissive glance in her direction, making her feel as though she was less of a person and more of an object under scrutiny. Alexis took a deep breath, trying to keep herself steady, but the mounting anxiety was hard to ignore. It felt as though with every minute that passed, the situation became more dire, more surreal. Suddenly, Harris demanded, "What's in your bag?" pointing to the small bag she'd left on the passenger seat. Alexis hesitated. In her bag were her work files, some personal items, and the small donation envelope she was planning to drop off at the community center. These were parts of her everyday life, private and normal. Things she'd never thought would be of interest to anyone, let alone two police officers treating her as if she were a criminal. She felt an uncomfortable violation creeping in as Harris leaned forward, his hand resting on the door handle. She didn't want him to open that bag. It wasn't just the invasion of privacy. It was the feeling that this officer, this stranger, was stripping away her dignity piece by piece in front of the whole neighborhood. But as she started to object, he gave her a hard stare, the kind that seemed to dare her to resist. She felt trapped. If she refused, would he escalate the situation further? Would he accuse her of resisting? The thought alone was terrifying. But then she noticed that more people were pulling out their phones, recording the unfolding events. It was then that she remembered her own phone, sitting in her pocket, and the idea of documenting the incident herself gave her a small but powerful sense of agency. Without drawing attention, she reached into her pocket, her hand brushing against her phone, and started recording the audio. She kept her movements discreet, not wanting to draw attention from Harris. Harris, seemingly unsatisfied with her response, sneered and said, "If you've got nothing to hide, you shouldn't be acting nervous." The words rang in her ears, a bitter echo of the countless stories she'd heard about people in her community who'd had similar encounters. She wanted to scream that she wasn't hiding anything, that this entire spectacle was based on nothing but his own prejudice. But she knew better. She had heard too many stories of people who'd spoken up in similar situations, only to have the encounter turn even uglier. So instead, she took a deep breath, keeping her voice as steady as possible. "I've been cooperative, officer. I'd just like to understand why this is happening," she said, her tone respectful but firm. Harris's eyes narrowed. He didn't respond directly, instead turning to Officer Grant and muttering something under his breath. Alexis couldn't catch what he was saying, but the expression on his face was unmistakable. He was enjoying this. This wasn't about law enforcement. It was about power, about showing her that he could put her in her place. The second officer, Grant, seemed slightly uncomfortable but said nothing, standing by his partner's side, silent but complicit. As the minutes dragged on, Alexis's initial fear transformed into something else: anger. She realized that this wasn't just a misunderstanding or a routine check. This was something more insidious. The realization stung, and a flash of defiance surged within her. She'd grown up in this community, volunteered her time, contributed to local programs, and built a life here. And now she was being humiliated by the very people meant to serve and protect. This wasn't just about her. It was about her family, her friends, her community. If she backed down now, she'd be allowing them to treat anyone this way. Harris noticed the shift in her demeanor, and his expression darkened. He stepped closer, invading her space with a smirk that seemed to challenge her to do something about it. He lowered his voice, just enough so that only she could hear. "People like you need to know when to keep your heads down," he whispered, the words dripping with contempt. It was the final straw. She felt a rush of adrenaline, and without a second thought, she spoke up, her voice steady and clear. "I've done nothing wrong, officer, and I'd like to know on what grounds you're detaining me." The words hung in the air, a quiet challenge. For a moment, Harris looked caught off guard, his bravado flickering as he registered her refusal to back down. Alexis could see the conflict in his eyes, the brief moment of hesitation. It was as though he hadn't expected her to speak up, hadn't expected her to stand her ground in front of everyone watching. But his expression quickly hardened, and he stepped back, raising his voice for everyone to hear. "We're conducting a lawful investigation, Mom," he announced, his voice loud and authoritative, meant to silence any further resistance. But the tide had shifted. The crowd, which had initially watched in silence, was now murmuring, and Alexis could sense that people were starting to question what they were seeing. A few of the onlookers called out, asking why she was being detained, and someone even shouted, "She hasn't done anything wrong." The officers exchanged a glance, realizing that the scene was no longer entirely in their control. Harris, clearly frustrated, clenched his jaw and glared at Alexis one last time before finally backing off, muttering something unintelligible as he turned away. Officer Grant, who had maintained a passive role throughout, seemed relieved to step back as well, as though he'd been hoping for an excuse to end the encounter. Without another word, the two officers retreated to their car, the tension dissipating as they drove away, leaving Alexis standing there, stunned but victorious. The crowd began to disperse, but the memory of the encounter lingered in the air. Alexis stood there, shaken but empowered, realizing that she had won a silent battle against an unjust authority. She could feel the adrenaline still rushing through her veins, but beneath it was a growing sense of pride. She hadn't just stood up for herself. She'd stood up for her as Alexis drove away from the scene, her hands still trembling on the steering wheel. Her mind raced with everything that had just happened. She replayed the events in her head, the sneer in Officer Harris's voice, the way he'd spoken down to her, the veiled threat in his tone. Her heart was still pounding, but alongside the residual fear, a new feeling had started to take root: resolve. She realized that this wasn't something she could simply move past or forget. The incident had shown her a dark side of her town she had only heard whispers about. She had always considered herself lucky to live in a community that felt safe and familiar, but now she was questioning how much of that safety was a facade, a privilege she'd taken for granted until today. That evening, as she sat down at her kitchen table, she debated her next move. Part of her just wanted to let it go, to chalk it up to a single bad experience and try to move on. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away, and she knew in her heart that if she didn't speak up, she'd be letting down not only herself, but also those in her community who didn't have the strength or platform to fight back. She picked up her phone and opened the recording she'd started during the encounter, listening to Harris's cold, calculated words echoing through her kitchen. Hearing his voice again ignited her anger, but it also fueled her resolve. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system that allowed people like him to get away with treating others as less than human. The following morning, Alexis contacted a local civil rights organization, explaining what had happened and asking for guidance. The representative on the other end of the line listened intently, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. When she finished recounting the events, the representative, a woman named Maria, responded with a tone of understanding that made Alexis feel seen and validated. "I want you to know that you're not alone in this, Alexis," Maria said firmly. "What you experienced is, unfortunately, not uncommon. We've had several similar reports about Officer Harris. If you're willing, we can file a formal complaint and take this to the next level. But this process won't be easy. It may involve public hearings, media attention, and scrutiny from both supporters and critics." Alexis took a deep breath, knowing the gravity of what she was about to commit to. She didn't take the decision lightly. As much as the thought of public exposure made her uneasy, she couldn't shake the image of Harris's smug face, his silent assertion that he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. She agreed to move forward. And with Maria's guidance, they began drafting a formal complaint. They detailed every aspect of the encounter, attaching the audio recording and witness statements from some of the onlookers who had stepped forward to support her. The days that followed were tense. Word of the complaint spread quickly through town, and soon local news outlets caught wind of the story. Alexis's phone began to ring incessantly, reporters wanting to hear her side, community members reaching out to express both support and criticism. Some of her neighbors warned her that this fight would only bring trouble, that she should have kept her head down and let it pass. But for every person who tried to dissuade her, there were 3 others who called her brave, who thanked her for standing up to the injustice they had also experienced in silence. Just as she was beginning to find some rhythm in this new reality, an unexpected twist occurred. A group of former high school classmates reached out to her, each with their own troubling stories about encounters with Officer Harris. They described situations eerily similar to hers, where Harris had overstepped his authority, used intimidation tactics, and targeted them based on nothing more than the color of their skin or their perceived social status. One woman, Sarah, recounted a terrifying experience from 5 years prior when Harris had pulled her over for a broken taillight that was actually working perfectly fine. He had searched her car, rifled through her belongings, and humiliated her on the side of the road for nearly an hour before letting her go with a warning. These stories, each more disturbing than the last, solidified Alexis's resolve. This was bigger than her. Harris had a history of abuse, one that he'd seemingly continued for years without any repercussions. Alexis felt a responsibility to amplify these voices, to make sure their experiences were known. She worked with Maria and the civil rights organization to gather these accounts, building a case against Harris that was no longer just about her single encounter, but about a pattern of behavior that revealed a systemic issue. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the community grew increasingly polarized. There were those who applauded Alexis for bringing attention to an issue that had been swept under the rug for too long, and there were others who criticized her for stirring up trouble and disrespecting law enforcement. Rumors circulated that Harris' department was feeling the pressure, and some officers were even quietly distancing themselves from him, knowing that his actions had cast a shadow over the entire force. Yet, in the face of the mounting backlash, Alexis refused to back down. The most shocking twist came a few weeks later, when Alexis received an anonymous tip from a former police officer who had recently retired from the force. He claimed to have witnessed Harris tampering with evidence in a separate case years ago and had felt powerless to speak up. "I was afraid of retaliation," he admitted over the phone, his voice strained with regret. "But I can't stay silent anymore. People like him are the reason I left the force. He's dangerous, and he knows how to work the system. Be careful, Alexis. Harris isn't the type to go down without a fight." This revelation sent chills down her spine, but it also deepened her resolve. She knew the risks, knew that challenging someone with that kind of unchecked power could have serious consequences, but she was no longer just fighting for herself. The community needed change, and she was willing to be the catalyst, even if it meant putting herself in the line of fire. With each new piece of information, The picture became clearer. Harris was more than just a bad cop. He was a product of a system that had allowed him to thrive unchecked, a system that had turned a blind eye to his abuses. As the civil rights organization filed a broader complaint, targeting not only Harris but the entire department for its failure to address the numerous complaints against him, the story exploded in the media. Reporters from national outlets began calling, and the town found itself under a spotlight it had never experienced before. For many, it was a wake-up call. For others, a harsh truth they weren't ready to face. But Alexis knew there was no turning back now. This wasn't just about exposing a single officer's misconduct. It was about forcing a reckoning, a demand for accountability and change that her community desperately needed. In the midst of all this, Alexis faced her own fears and doubts, wondering if she was strong enough to see this through. But every time she considered backing down, she remembered the faces of those who had come forward, the courage they had shown in sharing their own painful experiences. She knew they were looking to her for strength, for the chance to finally have their voices heard. And so, with the weight of their stories and her own fierce determination, Alexis pressed on, knowing that whatever the outcome, she had already achieved something meaningful. She had broken the silence, and there was no going back. Everyone who'd ever been in her position, everyone who had ever been made to feel small and powerless. And as she got back into her car, her hands still trembling, she knew that her life, and perhaps her entire community, would never be the same again. The days that followed were a whirlwind, as Alexis's fight with Officer Harris and the local police department took on a life of its own. She had gone from an ordinary woman in her community to a symbol of resistance, and the transformation was both empowering and terrifying. Every time she left her house, she could feel the weight of people's stares, hear the whispers that trailed behind her. Some people stopped her in the grocery store or on the street, offering words of encouragement and thanking her for standing up. Others, however, looked at her with disdain, muttering under their breath about troublemakers and disrespect for authority. She tried to steel herself against the criticism, knowing that standing up for what was right wouldn't come without a cost. The tension came to a head one evening when she decided to attend a town hall meeting. Word had spread that the meeting would address her case against Officer Harris, and the entire town seemed to have shown up, eager to see the showdown. Alexis walked into the crowded room, feeling the pressure of 100 pairs of eyes turning to follow her. She spotted familiar faces, neighbors, teachers, friends from the community center, many of whom gave her nods of encouragement. But there were others who sat with their arms crossed, faces twisted in judgment, as though she had betrayed the community by dragging their beloved town into such public turmoil. As the meeting started, the mayor took the podium, explaining that the town was undergoing an internal investigation into the complaints against Officer Harris. He assured the crowd that the process was fair and impartial, though Alexis couldn't shake the feeling that the system was still protecting its own. Just then, Officer Harris himself entered the room, flanked by several of his colleagues. The room fell silent, and Alexis felt a chill as he locked eyes with her from across the room. He smirked, a confident, almost taunting expression, as if he knew he had the upper hand. Harris' attorney stepped forward, launching into a prepared statement. He described Harris as an exemplary officer, praised by his peers for his dedication and courage. The attorney painted Alexis as an opportunist, suggesting she had exaggerated the encounter for personal gain and media attention. The words stung, twisting the reality of what had happened that day into a distorted version meant to discredit her. Alexis clenched her fists, feeling anger bubbling inside her as the attorney continued to spin a narrative that painted Harris as the victim. When it was finally her turn to speak, Alexis stood, her hands trembling slightly, though her voice was steady. She addressed the room, recounting her experience in vivid detail. She described the intimidation, the humiliation, and the feeling of helplessness she had felt standing by the side of the road while Harris had treated her like a criminal. As she spoke, she noticed people in the audience shifting uncomfortably, the weight of her words resonating with those who had experienced similar encounters. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for all the people who had been silenced, dismissed, and mistreated. Just as she was finishing, an unexpected voice spoke up from the back of the room. "I've had enough of Harris too." A man stood, his face flushed, as he recounted a similar incident with Officer Harris, explaining how he'd been pulled over for a minor traffic violation and treated with undue hostility. Another person followed, then another, until one by one, more people began to share their experiences. The room transformed, with voices rising in anger and frustration as the community began to openly confront the abuse they'd endured. Harris's smirk faded as he listened, visibly unnerved by the growing tide of accusations. Suddenly, the door swung open, and a figure Alexis hadn't seen in years stepped forward. Miss Thompson, the retired high school principal and a highly respected figure in the community. Miss Thompson had known Harris when he was a young officer, and her presence alone seemed to shift the entire atmosphere in the room. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes scanning the audience, before she spoke in a clear, steady voice. "I came here tonight because I believe it's time for the truth to be known. I've heard too many stories, seen too much evidence of abuse. We can't ignore this any longer." In the weeks that followed the explosive town hall meeting, the energy in Alexis's community was palpable. The temporary suspension of Officer Harris had sent shockwaves through the town, a signal that finally, the powers that be were beginning to take action. The local media continued to cover the story, interviewing residents and diving into past complaints that had gone unaddressed. For the first time, people were willing to come forward with their own stories of mistreatment, and soon, the case against Harris was no longer just about Alexis's encounter. It had become a larger, more systemic investigation. But for Alexis, the aftermath of that town hall was far more complicated. Each day, she grappled with the reality of being both an ordinary citizen and a public figure in the fight against injustice. Strangers would approach her on the street, some with tears in their eyes, thanking her for her bravery and sharing their own painful experiences. Yet others, mostly the vocal supporters of Harris and those resistant to change, would glare at her or even mutter cruel words under their breath. It seemed that nearly everyone in town had an opinion about her now, and while many stood by her, there was an undercurrent of resentment from those who felt she was disrupting the peace. The strain began to take its toll on her personal life. Friends she had known for years were now distant, uncomfortable with the attention and controversy surrounding her. Some had even cautioned her against pursuing the fight, warning her that this sort of scrutiny could be damaging not only for her but for her family. Alexis could feel the weight of these words pressing down on her, but she reminded herself of why she had begun this journey in the first place. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had been silenced, the ones who had felt powerless against a system that should have protected them. At home, Alexis found comfort in her son, Jason, who was just old enough to understand that something big was happening, even if he couldn't grasp the full extent of it. She could see the worry in his eyes whenever he heard a negative comment or saw the tension in her face after another draining day. One evening, as she tucked him into bed, he looked up at her with wide, serious eyes. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked quietly, his small hand reaching for hers. Alexis smiled, her heart swelling with pride and a touch of sadness. "Yes, honey, I'm okay. I'm doing something that's really important. It's hard, but it's the right thing to do." Despite the strain, Alexis found a growing support network in the most unexpected places. People she'd never met reached out to her with messages of encouragement. Local businesses offered to help in any way they could, some even placing signs in their windows reading, "We stand with Alexis." One afternoon, she received an email from a national civil rights group offering legal representation and guidance, assuring her that they were willing to support her case at no cost. The gesture felt like a lifeline. She had been navigating the storm mostly alone, and the support gave her a renewed sense of hope and resilience. Then a surprising development occurred that reignited the town's focus on the case. The internal investigation uncovered evidence of a long-standing pattern of abuse within the department. It turned out that Officer Harris wasn't the only one with a history of misconduct. Several other officers had similarly troubling records, though their actions hadn't been as publicized or notorious. The findings were enough to prompt an external review by the state's Department of Justice. For many in the community, this revelation was both shocking and, sadly, validating, proof that their concerns had been justified all along. The town's mayor, visibly shaken by the mounting public pressure and the escalating scandal, called an emergency press conference. In front of cameras and reporters, he apologized to the community, acknowledging the failures within the police department and promising sweeping reforms. He announced that Harris would remain on indefinite suspension pending further investigation, and that officers would undergo rigorous retraining with a focus on de-escalation and anti-bias practices. For the first time, Alexis felt a small glimmer of justice, a recognition, however belated, that change was on the horizon. But there was one last obstacle that she hadn't anticipated. As the state's Department of Justice stepped in to take over the investigation, Harris's supporters grew increasingly vocal, staging rallies and flooding social media with calls to restore order. Some claimed that he was the victim of a witch hunt and painted him as a scapegoat for problems that went beyond a single officer. Rumors began to spread, some suggesting that Alexis had orchestrated the entire incident for attention, others implying that she was an outsider who didn't belong in their community, despite her long-standing roots. Amid this backlash, Alexis received threatening messages, anonymous notes left on her car, letters slid under her front door, and even ominous phone calls late at night. Each threat felt like a stone added to the burden she was already carrying, and there were moments when the fear crept in, making her question whether this fight was worth the danger it was bringing into her life. But every time she felt herself wavering, she reminded herself of the faces of those who had come forward, the stories that had been silenced for so long. She reminded herself that giving up now would mean surrendering not just her fight, but the fight of everyone who had been made to feel powerless. One day, as she was walking home from a meeting with her legal team, she noticed a gathering of supporters outside her house. A crowd of familiar faces, including her neighbors, teachers, friends, and even a few strangers, had gathered with candles and signs of support. They had come to stand with her, a show of solidarity that left her overwhelmed with gratitude. As she approached, they greeted her with applause and words of encouragement, their presence a reminder that she was not alone in this battle. Among the crowd, she saw Ms. Thompson, the retired principal, who had become a fierce advocate for her cause. Miss Thompson embraced her, whispering, "You've given this town a reason to change, Alexis. Don't forget that." Buoyed by the support, Alexis felt her resolve strengthen. She realized that this fight had become bigger than her own story. It was a movement for change, for accountability, and for a community that was willing to confront its own shadows. And while she knew the road ahead would still be difficult, she was no longer afraid. She understood now that her actions had already made a difference, had already planted the seeds of a future where people like Harris would be held accountable, where voices like hers would no longer be silenced. As she stood among her friends and supporters that night, the air filled with the soft glow of candlelight, Alexis felt a deep sense of peace for the first time in weeks. She had set out to make a change, and while there were still battles left to fight, she knew that they were winnable. Her community had rallied around her, proving that even in the face of darkness, people were capable of coming together, of pushing for what was right. She had become not just a symbol of resistance, but a beacon of hope for those who had waited too long for justice. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought back to the day of the encounter, how an ordinary drive to the community center had spiraled into something extraordinary. She realized that, in the end, this was about more than just her or Harris. It was about a community taking responsibility for its future. The fight wasn't over, but she was no longer fighting alone. And as she drifted to sleep, She held on to the image of her friends, her neighbors, and the countless others who had found their voices alongside her, ready to carry this battle forward together. As the investigation into Officer Harris and the police department unfolded, the town entered a period of self-reflection and reckoning that touched every corner of the community. Conversations that once took place behind closed doors were now happening openly, and more people began to examine their own roles in either perpetuating or challenging the systems around them. Alexis became a steady presence at community forums, workshops, and even school assemblies, where she shared her story and helped facilitate discussions on accountability, justice, and community healing. The state's Department of Justice delved deeply into not only Officer Harris' behavior, but also the culture of the entire police department. Reports emerged detailing numerous cases of complaints that had been swept under the rug, instances of misconduct that had been excused or covered up. It was a painful reality for the town to face. Many residents who had once held the local police in high regard now found themselves questioning the very institution they had trusted to protect them. The pressure mounted for the police chief to resign, and community members began to demand structural reforms, advocating for civilian oversight committees, transparency in disciplinary actions, and more rigorous anti-bias training. Alexis became an advocate not just for accountability, but for education and empathy as well. She joined forces with Maria and other local activists to form a coalition, Voices for Justice, aimed at creating lasting change in their town. The group organized workshops on conflict resolution, anti-bias training, and community building exercises, inviting both law enforcement and residents to participate. Initially, the police department was reluctant, but as public pressure increased and as more officers realized the importance of building bridges with the community, attendance slowly grew. One evening, Alexis found herself sitting across from Officer Grant, the officer who had initially stood by Harris during her encounter, but later spoke out at the town hall meeting. He had attended one of the coalition's workshops, his face marked by an expression of quiet regret. They sat in a circle with other officers and residents, sharing their experiences and discussing how to move forward. When it was his turn to speak, Grant looked directly at Alexis, his eyes filled with remorse. "I'm sorry, Alexis," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I could have done something sooner. I could have spoken up years ago. I stayed silent because it was easier, because I thought it was just the way things were. But I see now that my silence hurt people like you, people who trusted us to do what's right. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to make it right." In that moment, Alexis felt a complex mix of emotions: anger, compassion, understanding. She had once viewed Grant as just another officer who had stood complicit in Harris's abuse of power, but seeing him now, acknowledging his role in the problem, she felt a glimmer of hope. The path to healing would be long, but this was a start. She nodded, accepting his apology, and encouraged him to continue working toward change within the department. It wasn't an easy moment, but it was a powerful one, and it resonated with everyone in the room. For the first time, it felt as though real progress was possible. The coalition's efforts began to ripple outward, sparking conversations and inspiring similar movements in nearby towns. News outlets continued to follow the story, documenting how a single act of courage had turned into a community-driven movement for justice. Alexis found herself invited to speak at events beyond her town, sharing her experience and advocating for communities to hold their own institutions accountable. She had transformed from a regular citizen to a leader, a voice for the silenced, and a symbol of resilience. The impact on the town itself was profound. Local schools started to implement programs focused on empathy, respect, and civic responsibility, aiming to teach the next generation the importance of standing up for what was right. City officials worked closely with the Voices for Justice Coalition to create new policies around law enforcement accountability and transparency, including the Citizen Review Board tasked with investigating complaints against officers. There was resistance, of course, from some who viewed these changes as unnecessary or even hostile to law enforcement. but the majority of the community supported the reforms, having witnessed firsthand the consequences of unchecked power. Months after the initial confrontation, Alexis received an unexpected letter. It was from Officer Harris, written from a distance now that he had been formally dismissed from the force. In the letter, he offered a curt acknowledgement of his actions, though it was far from a heartfelt apology. Instead, it was an expression of bitterness, a refusal to take full responsibility. But Alexis found that the words did not affect her as they once might have. She no longer needed his validation or his remorse to move forward. She had reclaimed her power, and the community had responded with strength, resilience, and unity. Harris was a painful chapter, but he was no longer the focus. The story had evolved beyond him. Alexis's personal life, once so disrupted by the ordeal, began to settle into a new normal. Friends who had once distanced themselves started to reach out again, some expressing regret for not supporting her sooner, others simply thankful for her courage. Her son, Jason, had grown more mature through the experience, his understanding of justice and courage shaped by watching his mother stand up for what was right. He often asked questions about her work with the coalition, his curiosity and admiration clear, and Alexis felt a deep satisfaction knowing that he would grow up in a community that was actively striving to be better. The coalition continued to work tirelessly, expanding their focus to address broader issues within the community: economic disparities, educational inequities, and racial divides that had been simmering below the surface for years. Alexis found herself in a new role as a community leader, advocating not just for police reform, but for a stronger, more inclusive town. Each meeting, each workshop, each conversation contributed to a growing foundation of trust and mutual respect within the community. People were beginning to see each other as allies rather than strangers, united in the desire for a safer, more just environment. One evening, nearly a year after the incident that had sparked it all, the town held a community celebration to honor the progress they had made. Alexis stood on stage, looking out over the crowd, a mix of familiar and new faces, each one representing a piece of the journey. The mayor presented her with a plaque, acknowledging her courage and resilience, and the crowd erupted in applause. As she looked out over the sea of faces, she felt a wave of gratitude and pride wash over her. This was the town she had always loved, the community that had come together to demand better, and, in doing so, had transformed itself. As the event wound down, Miss Thompson approached her, her face glowing with pride. "You did it, Alexis," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've shown this town what it means to be brave, to be resilient. We owe you so much." Alexis smiled, feeling the weight of the journey settle into a memory, a story that would live on in the town's history. "We did it together," she replied, her voice soft but strong. "This was all of us." The night ended with a quiet but powerful sense of unity, a feeling that resonated through the town long after the celebration was over. Alexis walked home with Jason by her side, his hand warm in hers, as he asked questions about the future and what they would do next. She answered patiently, knowing that their journey was far from over, but that they had laid a foundation for something lasting and meaningful. As they reached their front door, Alexis looked back at her town, now illuminated in the glow of streetlights and the distant laughter of friends and neighbors. It was a place transformed, a place she was proud to call home. In the months to come, she would continue her work, facing new challenges and helping others find their own voices. And though the fight for justice and accountability would always be ongoing, she knew that together they had created something unbreakable, a community that would never again turn a blind eye, a town that now stood together in the pursuit of a better, brighter future for everyone.